And it says we are live. This is probably the earliest we've jumped on. Those of you guys that are new to this, my name is Edgar and and this is the Guns for Everyone podcast. The other guy that does this with me regularly, he could say his name.
Yes, I'm Isaac Chase, and I'm on time.
Nice. Yeah, we had a few technical difficulties, but we're on. Before we jump off and we get started, the title of this, I set it as link between guns and suicide. Obviously, we can talk about other topics. It doesn't necessarily need to be about that. But our two guests that you see on the screen, they're officially, Matt is officially with Firearms Injury Prevention Initiative. I don't know, Mike, Dr. Victoroff, he'll explain a little bit about what he does. I do have to stress that they're here on their own accord. They're not here representing FIPI in any way, shape, or form. I serve on the advisory board for FIPI and the Firearm Safety Coalition here in the state of Colorado. We could talk about that. On our Reddit, which Reddit is a cesspool of information, so we decided to create a Reddit. So we're like, why not join the cesspool of information? And somebody posed a question on there and asked me about how I feel about the tax law and us being taxed to fund certain projects, being that I talk about the link between guns and suicide. And I have to stress that I don't believe there's a link between guns and suicide other than guns are used for suicide. I think we'll discuss that a little bit further as well. But it was a great question. If you're not on our Reddit, go join it so we can kind of dilute the cesspool a little bit. But with that said, I'm gonna let everybody kind of introduce themselves, and I think Isaac does a good job at navigating this, which means I sit back in the background and talk and don't talk. I mean, and kind of let him do his thing. So, yeah, we'll start with Dr. Victoroff. If you want to say words and say things about yourself and who you are, what you do, why you do it, and a little bit about your work with FIPI and all that stuff.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll kind of keep it short, and then if the questions come up about my character or motivations, then I'll defend myself as we go along. I had been a family practitioner for a few decades, and I've worked for a long time in other areas. I was a medical malpractice risk consultant, looked at medical errors a lot, physicians who screwed up and ways to mitigate that and to help prevent it. So preventive medicine in the sense of error trapping has been a part of my research forever. Almost 30 years ago, I started getting interested in guns because they're part of my culture. So I went out and tried to learn everything that I could as a physician about firearms, and that meant getting into training and playing gun games. I got myself certified as an instructor with several of the large national organizations, and I teach pistol, rifle, shotgun, personal protection kinds of thing, similar to what Edgar and I guess Isaac do. In the course of that, I started playing gun games like IPSC and IDPA and, trap shooting, and, just things that go bang and make calls I enjoy. But as a physician, one of the things that bothered me increasingly was the profound lack of knowledge and information that my colleagues had when they were doing counseling about firearms risk. Suicide, yes. And I think a lot of us think there are at least 8 or 9 domains of firearm injury, of which suicide is certainly the biggest concern. But there are other things. And I found that the doctors and psychologists that I worked with regularly um, not only didn't know much about firearms, but were kind of inexcusably giving information to people about how to protect themselves from firearm injuries. And that got really troubling to me. So I got into the business more than 10 years ago with some of the folks who are now at FIPI. And, Matt and I have known each other now quite a while. On a quest to do professional education for healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, PAs, practitioners, psychologists, counselors, all those folks who have the occasion to talk to someone who might be at risk for a firearms mishap, of which there are a variety. And that's kind of what I do now these days. Among other things, I teach classes for my colleagues in how to not be an idiot when you're trying to reduce the risk of firearms danger. So, yeah, and in that connection, I've met a lot of really interesting and good people, including the faces on the screen here.
Yeah, I really appreciate being here. Super duper appreciate. I know you're a busy guy and you got other stuff to do, so thanks for making time. Another guy that's busy all the time and I appreciate your presence as well. That's Matt. So I'm going to let you speak and say words. If you haven't seen the podcast that Matt and I made a while back, we had an episode where we talked about 2A purity and the silliness that people are unwilling to have conversations with the other side just because they might differ in opinions and all that stuff. And it's I think it's a good watch. But Matt, how about you?
Yeah, my name is Matt Wettenkamp. As mentioned earlier, I currently work for CU at the Firearms Injury Prevention Initiative. My job is a lot of outreach to, I would say it's bi-directional outreach. So on the one hand, I do a lot of outreach to firearm owners, gun owners in Colorado and nationally, talking about the intersection of firearms and suicide primarily, but really firearm injury, unintentional injury of any kind. But then also in the opposite direction. So similar to what Michael was talking about, talking to a lot of doctors, researchers, pediatricians, mental health care professionals, and folks who are not gun owners themselves, don't feel particularly comfortable talking to their patients about guns, don't understand gun culture, and talking to them about firearm owners, and try to help them feel more comfortable having those conversations. As far as my background, I call myself a lifelong gun owner. Grew up into a home and family that owned guns. Grew up hunting and shooting. Joined the Marine Corps at 18. Was a scout sniper in the Marines. Deployed to Iraq in 03. Combat veteran. After I got out of the Marines, I've spent the last 12 plus years working in a variety of spaces, kind of focused on mental health, suicide prevention. So a couple of different veterans nonprofits, state of Colorado, now the University of Colorado. And as far as, I guess one thing I would just flag as far as what changed things for me, I have this distinct memory of several years ago, probably 5 or 6 years ago at this point, being in a working group. Cross-agency people, public, private, nonprofit, variety of people from a variety of different places. And we were tasked with working together to reduce veteran suicide. And we needed to figure out what our 4 key priority areas were going to be. And everybody in the room was in unanimous agreement that lethal means safety and firearms needed to be one of those 4 key priority areas. And I was the one, there's always one in the room, right? I was the one in the room that said, you all have lost your minds. You want us to devote 25% of our time, energy, resources into, trying to convince veterans to give up their guns. You're out of your minds. And this was after having worked in veteran services. I had gone through all the suicide prevention trainings. I had done all that. And even still then, the issue wasn't clear in my mind. And thankfully, they didn't kick me out of the group. Instead, they pointed me in the right direction of a few different literature, trainings, things like that. And in digging into some of the data, I had my mind completely changed on it. Where then I saw the issue. I saw it for what it was. I saw the risk. My beliefs about firearm ownership haven't changed since then. I'm still, devoted to a supporter, absolutist, pro-gun rights, still a gun owner, and I want to see the Second Amendment and gun rights protected and preserved in this country. But I do see I see the problem differently now, and I think I've found middle ground. I found ground to stand on where you can be the most pro-gun person around, but still see the problem for what it is and look for solutions that people can reach for and use that don't involve government intervention, that don't involve government, stepping in and taking charge. There are things that we can do as gun owners, as a firearm community, to be protectors and save lives.
Well, that was brief. Good job. No, I'm just kidding. I think all that background's really necessary because I think understanding people's motivations is important for trust and also kind of gauging competency around that. So having an MD who's also a NRA certified and other organization certified instructor means you don't have a tourist who is, poking their head into the gun world because they know about family safety. And for you, Matt, having a background in with firearms and military and suicide, and also at the same time having a devoted interest to solving problems and not just being an educator. Because I haven't met you, Mike, first face to face, but Matt, I watched your presentation in Alamosa or where Monte Vista, and I was really impressed with that solution focused approach to the risk of firearms and mental health and all that stuff. So it wasn't just like this many people die. It was, this is how we actually reduce the risk. This is how we prevent negative outcomes. So all that to say, a lot of background I think is good and necessary. I don't know you two as well as Edgar does. So I'm coming at this from a place of, Mike, I just met you. Mike or Michael, do you care? Do I just call you doctor?
Oh God, no, huh? Not unless you're sick.
Okay. I just met you on Tuesday, but I think that we all kind of have an understanding of what's drawing us to this problem. And it's like for me personally, and I think for Edgar, it's coming from a place of we got to stop offloading this problem to other people, and we need to start taking responsibility for this as a community of gun owners, a community of fellow humans, a community of people with shared experiences. And so I kind of wanted to start with a question for Matt, which is, you kind of talked about your background, but I can tell that you really understand what you're talking about. Like we talked about on Tuesday, you have to know what you're talking about to be able to share it with other people. What would you say is driving your deep interest in this particular topic of preventing negative outcomes, speaking about mental health and solving problems like around this problem in the community?
I think it's because I see it as solvable. I see it as a solvable problem. If we're narrowing in, we're talking specifically about firearm suicide. This is a solvable problem, and there are things that people will say, on this topic. Guns are just a tool. Why are you focusing on guns? Maybe something like somebody who wants to die by suicide, they'll find a way. They'll do it eventually. They'll find a way, whether they have a gun or not. Things like that. And admittedly, those were the exact sorts of things I probably said in that working group meeting that I mentioned earlier. And what I came to learn and find out is that that's not the case. There's so many different things that point to this being solvable. And I hesitate to throw out too many statistics and drown you in numbers, but there's a few that just have always stuck with me and really stand out. This idea that somebody, if they really want to, they'll find a way. We know that more than 90% of people who attempt suicide don't eventually go on to die by suicide. If it is an unsuccessful attempt and they survive it, 90% don't. And it's, why is that? Well, it's because after that they get help, and people who get help get better. Another thing on this idea of, if they want to, they'll find a way. What we know about your kind of typical or average suicide attempt is that the attempt is acted upon in under less than an hour from when the person decides that they're going to do it. So this isn't something that's being dwelled on and planned out for weeks or months or years. Sometimes it is, but most studies show that the overwhelming majority of people, it's an hour or less. And then the third piece of it for me is just the lethality of firearms. So, someone says, well, if they don't have a gun, they'll just use something else. Great. That's my goal. I mean, certainly give me a world with 0 suicide attempts, but that's never going to happen. So just give me one with less firearm suicide attempts, because an attempt with a gun is fatal 90% of the time. If you take all non-firearm attempts and lump them together as one statistic, they're fatal less than 10% of the time. So in that, again, 1 hour of immense crisis on somebody's having the worst day of their life, what do they have to reach for? Is it the 90% lethal tool, or is it quite literally anything else? And I think those are the 3 things that really stuck with me from the very beginning, and said, like, this is preventable. This is absolutely preventable. And we don't need the government to get involved and step in to do this. I talked to a lot of people about, things like extreme risk protection orders, red flag laws, that sort of thing. And, my message is always, like, we don't need it. We've got the ability to do this within the community, to look out for one another. And that's really all it takes.
Yeah, I think that first part about it's a solvable problem. I think one of my experiences teaching in the classroom about another topic, which is, self-defense law and understanding and navigating the legal aftermath of a self-defense incident. And when you kind of lay things out, a lot of people get really frustrated because they feel like, well, I'm going to lose either way, so why even try? And it kind of rings true with what you said about solvable problems. Like, there are ways to approach the legal aftermath that improve outcomes, reliably improve outcomes. And so if your attitude is like, why even try, then yeah, it's going to seem unsolvable. But if you understand how the system works, if you understand why the system works the way it does, then it's not that hard to find better outcomes. You just have to be willing to do the thing. You have to be willing to prepare ahead of time. You have to think it through and understand the risk and all that stuff. Michael, do you have anything to add to Matt's view of the problem as a solvable problem?
Well, what we can do is we can peel into it a little bit, because I think the going after it like a solvable problem is the absolutely first way to begin. But I worked for many years in accident prevention, violence detection, mental health diagnosis, safety, active shooter defense, all kinds of things. I was an FAA examiner for a while. I was real interested in trying to keep pilots from crashing their airplanes. So I spent a lot of time, trying to foresee things that are foreseeable. And right after we say that, most of this stuff should be preventable, we should go after, like backyard swimming pool drownings. Let's look at that. There's quite a few of those, even though everyone knows that there's that thing back there. And if your 2-year-old walks into it, they could die. So yeah, it's there. And there's going to be a certain baseline, unpredictable, unpreventable incidents of adverse events, like, sometimes your car skids on the ice, even when you're careful. I've fallen down skiing. I mean, my God, and there's no excuse for that. So, part of life is dealing with the unpreventable. And so I think, where Matt and I have had some good talks is this discussion about if we want to maximize the preventable instances and minimize the ones that we just absolutely could not foresee or stop, what makes sense?
Yeah, I think that's for me. You kind of touched on this a little bit. Is this idea of, because when I first started talking about suicide prevention and just negative outcomes with firearms, I try and avoid the verbiage gun violence, because it seems like a weird thing to say, gun violence, since it's either violence or it's not violence. Like it's one or the other. We've never called it foot violence or car violence. It's just like that was, so I try and avoid it. So negative outcomes with firearms, and you guys know this. A lot of people are hesitant to have that conversation because now they think guns, that equals guns are bad. Like, no, guns are not bad. Guns are good, but they can be they are lethal. I mean, at the end of the day, they are a lethal tool, especially in the hands of bad actors. So used maliciously, used negligently, for sure. But I think what you say, Doctor, is true, and that's this idea that it's a numbers game, right? Like, again, you mentioned the airline pilots. So I'm sure if we look at the numbers, the people who frequently die in airplane crashes are people who fly the fucking things. So people who die in car accidents are people who drive the cars and are in cars or whatever. Like it's those are the numbers. So when we look at guns, it happens to be gun owners, and so now we have to learn how to mitigate that, because we do own the tools, and it is a little bit more permanent, and it is a little bit more accessible, and fast and quick. I think Isaac and I still remember this conversation. You and Isaac and we had this conversation many, many years ago in some of our very first podcasts. And that's this idea is just like, we have to stop pretending that guns are not very easy to use in suicides and in murders and everything else. So we can have guns are awesome for self-defense, for recreational purposes, for tyranny purposes, for all of that stuff, but we also can admit their lethality and their ease of use for bad actors.
Yeah, I think people, the moment you start bringing up responsibility, I think people start to look at that in terms of you telling them what to do, and instead of them taking it as a, how do we all work together for better outcomes? So they, and I'm not sure where that comes from. I'm not sure why people jump to that conclusion so quickly. I wonder if sometimes it's because in the conversation around firearms, the word responsibility somehow gets like lumped in with, the government's going to be responsible for you if you're not going to do it for yourself. But we have a responsibility as gun owners to confront a real problem. And Matt, you know the numbers better than I do, but it's obvious by far that intentional acts of self-harm are by far the biggest risk of firearms, of negative outcomes with firearms. And so if we're not even willing to just confront that problem, then what kind of responsible community can we really say we are? And like we did a lot of work in the 60s, 70s, 80s. When I say we, I mean the gun community, towards reducing accidents with firearms. Yep. And to great effect. I mean, if you look at the stats, it's kind of incredible how much better we got at controlling accidents with firearms. But we haven't really done anything as a community to attack this problem.
Only Michael was around for that.
Yeah, only Michael was around.
Yeah, I was there. On that. Okay, so to peel a little bit deeper in that, then we are fighting attitudinal problems, far more than we're fighting mechanical problems or legal problems. You could pass a law that suicide is illegal. We've had them a few hundred years ago. Oh yeah, it's illegal to commit suicide. Okay, great. What does that do to the statistic? 0. Well, I was part of a big interview and an article in the New York Times a few years ago where we were talking about dementia and suicide in old people. And one of my colleagues who's real smart, Matt knows very well, an ED doctor named Emmy Betts. I mean, you guys know her too. Everybody knows Emmy. So she and I were talking about what do we do about old people who are just not thinking so good anymore. I'm rapidly becoming one of them, so this is on my mind occasionally. And we wrote about, let us try to interpose some distance between people that are not making good judgment calls anymore, and the guns that they've had in the safe now for 45 years or however. And we got it was a nice article, it was the obvious things that you could say yourself. But the letters to the editor, we got hundreds of responses to the editors about that article. And some of them, dozens, stood out in my mind. And the theme was all the same. It was, wait a minute, my gun is the solution to dementia for me. That's my exit strategy. You absolutely do not want to lock it up in a safe where I don't remember the combination, because as soon as I get to that moment where I feel like I'm not doing well, defined by me, that's when the gun is going to be its most useful. Its last bullet will be the best thing I do for myself. That is a very common, popular, characteristic American sentiment. And I'm not going to tell you what I think the remedy is, because I don't really have one. I simply want to throw that onto the table with the other dominoes, because it's part of the game.
That's a very tough one, right? One of the conversations that I always have at the risk of my own freedom and my rights is my own desire and my deep yearn for the urn, just on a regular basis. Now, obviously, I'm here and I don't actually have. It's a weird, complex thing that goes on in my brain where it's just like I'm ready to die, but like I'm not gonna do it myself. But it's a complex conversation to have. Of there are humans like myself that exist that are look themselves in the mirror every single day and confront reality and navigate the emotions. And then there's other humans that don't know how to navigate the emotions, that are they're afraid to confront the reality of like, what is this feeling that I don't want to be alive anymore, but I don't, there's no immediate solution for me. So like, how do I navigate this stuff? And I think that's why these conversations are important, because there are humans, whether we like it or not, that have that same feeling. Isaac has confronted me about that feeling. And I won't say what he what he told me to do, because then he'll sound like an asshole. But it's important to have these conversations, because it's a reality. People think that this is not a reality. It is 100% a reality that people deal with every single day. And we're just too cautious with having these conversations, and they're complex. They're very complex thoughts. They're very complex, very nuanced thoughts. And the more we have these conversations, the more we get to a point where it's just like we minimize it. We're open about it. We're unafraid. And I think in history, I think we've seen that kind of solves a lot of things, is where we're just open about it. Good and bad, by the way. Good and bad.
Yeah, I think there's a psychological phenomenon that's pretty well documented and established about how people feel like a problem is less real when they don't confront it. But what tends to happen is it just grows and gets bigger. And I think as a community, the gun community is afraid to look at this problem because it kind of requires us to look inward and look at the people around us and acknowledge that it's possible that one of those people around us may be at risk for this. And that shines a light on us, and it shines a light on our friends and family, and it shines a light on the gun, and it shines a light all over the place. Edgar mentioned kind of one subset. Michael mentioned another subset. Matt, I'm interested to hear from you. What are some of the others? Because these are like existential problems, facing dementia, facing the existential crisis of realizing the universe is going to die in a heat death at some point. But there's a lot of other subsets of what we would consider maybe, I don't know if easier is the right word, but maybe easier to prevent negative outcomes. You have the guy whose wife left him and then, his car stopped working and then he got fired all in the same day. What kinds of other subsets do you think are important that we understand more about or take concrete steps personally and as a community to focus on reducing?
Well, at the risk of not directly answering your question, my approach to this, my mindset to this, when people ask, often the questions are asked like, well, what about this scenario? What about this individual scenario? And I had this realization about myself, a couple of years ago, where my wife, one of her younger siblings, my wife told me about one of her younger siblings going through a mental health crisis and had expressed some suicidal ideations. And, her parents were aware of it. They were on top of it. But given my line of work, the first thing that entered my mind and the first thing I said to my wife was, I know your dad's got guns in the house. Does she know how to access them? And that would not have been my instinctual response prior to that, years prior to that. And if there's one switch that I could flip in the mind of every gun owner in America, it's that. When there's someone around you in your sphere that you're concerned about, let's have a conversation about the guns. And then we can figure out all the rest later. And this applies whether you're talking about a 90-year-old with dementia, a 16-year-old whose girlfriend just broke up with him, your friend or brother who, kind of like you said, got fired from his job one day and served with divorce papers the next day. There's an infinite number of these different kind of subsets or situations. But if the first thought is, I'm really worried about this person that I care about, and so I'm going to see if they'll let me hold on to their guns overnight, and then we can address whatever the issue is tomorrow. That alone could save tens of thousands of lives in a year in America, right? Just because another thing that we know when it comes to suicide, a majority of suicide attempts take place within 24 hours of some kind of serious life crisis, something bad happening to somebody. And then within 24 hours, they decide, F it, I'm done, I'm going to do this. And then there's that 1 hour I mentioned, right? Within 1 hour of making that decision, the attempt is made. And so if we can think about it in those terms, where, again, there's an infinite number of different scenarios and situations and trouble that people can get themselves into in life, legal, financial, marital, you name it. But we know when someone is not right, like it. Someone who's close to you and well, when they're not right, and we just have to be willing to have that conversation and say, hey man, I'm really worried about you. I'd sleep a whole lot better tonight if your guns were locked up in my safe for the night, or put them in your safe and let me take the keys home with me. I'd sleep a lot better tonight. We can talk about this and figure it out tomorrow. But just for now, that to me, that's the low hanging fruit. Like that's the easy solution there. And obviously you can get into more complicated ones, right? Like the elderly person with an incurable disease or dementia or something like that. I have sympathy for that person. I'm not necessarily opposed to the idea of medical assisted interventions and suicides in that kind of way. Someone who's in extreme pain, end of their life, and they want to end it on their terms. I'm not opposed to that sort of thing, but think about that. Someone's grandfather, using a firearm to die by suicide. Who's going to find him? Who's going to clean up that mess? You hear about people who call 911 and commit suicide on the phone because they don't want a family member to come and find them. Well, think about those EMS folks, right? This is an ugly, tragic, messy situation, and there are better solutions to these problems.
Yeah, Dr. Victoroff, you had something, and I know you said not to call you doctor because we're not sick.
Edgar's sick.
I'm in the head.
Well, he's always sick.
I just want humans to put some respect on your name.
If I work that hard, I might want that too.
Correct. So I just want people to call you to know you're a doctor and all that stuff. I know at the end of the day it's not super important, but it's a respect thing. So I seen you gesturing, so there's no format here. There's no any of that stuff. So you be as yourself as you want to be.
Well, I do actually have a couple of doctor stories. Springboarding off a mat. Oh, that's a good image, actually. Okay, so I have helped quite a number of people die through medical means in those extremities where there is no other solution, and what they're facing is a miserable few weeks or months that they don't wish to go through. And I'm with Matt on this in an ethical, very thoughtfully considered ethical position. I believe that there is such a thing as a rational suicide, where that is probably the thing that's in your best interest right now, and we should make that as clean and easy and pleasant as possible. And I've been involved in a number of those, and they work good. And usually it's cancer, but sometimes it's something else. And so that allows me to then split a hair and define a difference between what rational suicide and a crazy suicide, or let's call it impulsive. Let's say there's impulsive suicide where you haven't really been thinking this through. And what you do is you've left a catastrophic, nasty mess for your loved ones, which is one of the worst sights they're ever going to see. And it's expensive and it's mean-hearted. It's inconsiderate. I really, let's talk about this firearms guy. That gun is not really the kind of way out that you want. Okay, so you drive into the woods, do it there. Again, now they don't know where you are. Oh, come on. There isn't really a very good way to do this with a firearm. So I'm going to say, let us not use guns for misuse. Could I say that's a misuse of guns? There's other ways to help yourself out of the world. And then let's go back to impulse, okay? Because Matt said something that I halfway argue with. The part I don't argue with is that there are red flags, let's just call them psychological indicators, that people can rely on to know when somebody's having trouble. And those are valid because we're human beings. We have empathy, we have instincts, except for psychopaths. Welcome all, but the psychopaths can't do this. We know when somebody's in trouble, but the part I disagree with is the doctoring part. This is another statistic I quote all the time when I talk about suicide. Psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and family doctors like me, people who occasionally talk to someone and then they get a phone call the next day and say, oh, they killed themselves. Did you know that? We are crap, lousy, bad at predicting suicide. The statistic is that the most experienced psychiatrists who deal with depression, by choice all day long, have not been able to predict suicide any better in the year 2022, or when the last I looked. Modern psychiatric method is no better at doing that than it was in 1950. Our method of knowing who's going to kill himself sucks. And it's because suicidality is inherently a deceptive mental condition. You lie to yourself, and you lie to the people around you. And there's many secondary reasons why you would do that. No point in going into it. But the fact is that, just to use an example, my brother shot himself to death just a couple of months ago. His wife was in the room. She had no idea that he was on that brink. And as Matt said, this is absolute gospel, 100% true. I am 100% sure that he had no idea that that was the day that he was going. When he got up that morning, he was playing with his grandkids. He had no idea that, tonight I'm going to shoot myself. It was utterly impulsive, instantaneous, unpredictable, and I hate to say, unstoppable. Now, we'll go into the could it have been stopped thing, because, my conscience makes me wonder about that. Yeah. And, he's the guy that kept the gun in his dresser drawer. So we could talk a little bit about that. But the bottom line about suicide prediction is, even at very best, if all the red flags are flying and you have really people of good intention around you, we still have a problem that some of these are going to squeak through.
Yeah, and I think that's the tough thing, right? Is that we have humans in the political world who talk about this absoluteness, and like we must end it all, and until there's no more of these, and then we see what the UK is doing, and I know it's a cliche to talk about that because now they're talking about knives, and it just this never-ending story of like, where does it end? And this is why we in the gun community have this mentality of like, they're really just trying to control you and not control the stuff. So, doctor, from that perspective, how do we get to a point where we start to trust the medical community again with this information? Because you just unloaded a fuck ton on us. So I'm still trying to process what you just said about your family. So like my little emotional side, Isaac knows I get super emotional about all this stuff, is trying to process what the fuck you just told me. And but also trying to mix it in with the other stuff that you said. And that's the medical professionals. And I think humans like myself and Isaac and a lot of people understand this, is that the medical profession does kind of suck at this, but pretends like they're really awesome at predicting. So how do we get to a point where the gun community can trust their doctor? And is there a way that we kind of bridge that, where like I still need to go get checked up and I still need to talk to somebody? I don't, but I know there's a lot of people who rely on talking to their doctors or psychiatrists. So is there a way where we can get back to that?
Well, just to answer you directly, I think Matt also knows about this stuff. I used to teach ethics at the University of Denver. I taught all kinds of medical ethics and business ethics. And one of the moral problems that we got asked every once in a while was, what justifies you from throwing yourself on another person and preventing them from committing suicide? Like, why do you grab someone who is teetering, on the Golden Gate Bridge? Why would you ever do that? How dare you? What about my own personal right to run my life? And so I do have an extremely satisfying answer for that, for me as a doctor, because I've been doing this for almost 50 years, and I still do it. and Edgar, if you were the guy tying the knot in the rope, and looking longingly at the tree, I would tackle you. But because of this is an absolute fact that when we do that, and the person has a chance to calm down and think and talk and cool off, every single time, without exception, that I've been involved in one of those, they said, "Thank you." Every time they said, "My God, I don't know where my head was. I was so deranged. I wouldn't be here except for you. Thank you, thank you, thank you." And that's part of Matt's statistic, which I endorse, that after you've been through a thing like that, you never need to go through it again. People think that, nope, suicide was not the right choice at that time, and it's probably not going to be the right choice in the future. So knowing that, I'm building on that as the foundation. Then, okay, what should doctors do? Well, the answer is that they need to not threaten people with this thought that if I tell anyone I'm having trouble, they're going to lock me up or medicate me into unconsciousness or take away my guns or my kids or my family, my car, something. I'm going to be so punished for admitting that I need some help. And I wish I could say, "Oh, you got it all wrong. That ain't going to happen." I mean, no, we're lovely people. Look how nice and reasonable we are. Look at how logical our care system and our laws are. So you have nothing to fear about losing your civil rights. Just come ask for the help. My God, we so want you to live. But don't we smile when I say that? Because the medical health professions have got some work to do in disabusing people of that experience, that, oh God, if I confess that I got real mad at the donut guy this morning, maybe I'll get locked up. I better keep my mouth shut.
This is just a small aside, but I literally just got a notification on my phone that YouTube has taken down my stream because we're talking about suicide. So
YouTube was down on our side, but it's back up. So my wife is telling me that.
Yeah,
it was down, but it's back up.
The cancer people that I used to deal with never used the word physician-assisted suicide. They always called it self-deliverance. Maybe we should just change the title
to self-deliverance.
Well, yeah. I want to kind of get some input from Matt on the successful strategies. I mean, because we're kind of talking about what does work. From your knowledge and your experience, Matt, what would you say is some kind of way to teach successful strategies and tactics that are likely to work for, not for everybody, but to solve the biggest group of problems with the least amount of resistance that you kind of experience in teaching and your research and your exposure to these problems?
I think the first thing is to talk about secure storage. How and where you store your firearms really matters. And it can be for, you, the adult gun owner in the home. It could be for, a teenager who's in the home who has access to the gun. But it's secure storage options, both in home and out of home. We know that any delay, any extra step that somebody has to take between that decision to attempt suicide and pulling the trigger, any additional step that they have to take is an additional decision point where they've got to make that decision. And so even something as simple as like having to open the safe. And so we even talk to people about, where you keep your most available gun, your most available handgun. Maybe it's putting a picture of your family or your kids on the outside of your gun safe or your lockbox or something like that, right? So having something not within arm's reach is step one. And then we can talk about the different options that someone has for storage, not just on a daily basis, because if we could predict what day in the future we're going to have the worst day of our lives, then we could plan accordingly. But that's not typically the way it works, right? Those things sneak up on us. And so practicing, having secure storage practices every single day is important. We talk, but there's also out-of-home options, right? So there's a lot of things that we do in Colorado and organizations nationally that find out-of-home storage solutions. So you can take your firearms to different gun shops, ranges that provide storage in their facilities. Depending on what your state laws are, this practice is either 100% easy and free and legal, or maybe you're like Colorado, in which case, we have it written into law. It was in the 2013 background check bill that required background checks on all firearms transfers. They wrote in exceptions for temporary transfers. So a friend is able to legally hold on to them for up to 72 hours. Family, and it's a very broad definition of family, can hold on to them for as long as necessary. It could be years, as long as you're considering it to be a quote unquote, temporary transfer. So that's the biggest thing for me is one, the awareness piece I mentioned earlier. My wife and her sibling, we can have that switch flip in gun owners' minds where we ask about it, we're concerned about it. It's one of the first things we think about in a situation like this. But two, it's then what do you do with it? And it's the storage piece, keeping it temporarily inaccessible. And again, this isn't the sort of thing. I think one of the, a couple of things that I think all three of you have touched on, and it made me keep coming back to it. The question of why is this so difficult and what's the challenge? Well, one of the challenges is that, I would say, the history of talking about guns and suicide, most of the people talking about the link between guns and suicide and the risk are perceived by gun owners to be anti-gun. Medical professionals, whether mental health or otherwise, are perceived that way. The messaging is often coming from government, politicians, public health, universities, researchers. These are all perceived to be, at the very least, left-leaning and anti-gun, institutions. And it's important. That's why I think conversations like this are so important, and why I love you guys at Guns for Everyone so much, is because you take this seriously and see it as a role for the firearms community to play in this on this topic.
Well, it's our responsibility, right? Like at the end of the day, we're the gun owners, we're the people holding the tools. If I was into racing, I think I would like to believe that I'd be into how do we mitigate car accidents and all that stuff, because I'm in the car world, right? But so we own the tools, and I have to talk about, I know for me, from my own personal fucked up head and my emotions and all the stuff that I have to deal with, it's one of the things that helps me squash it is being so open about it. It's I was Isaac and I were talking on a different episode on our, like, how Guns for Everyone started, and I've heard Penn and Taylor touch on this. So, like, we talk about how we met and our origin story, and we talk about it so much that at some point we don't even know what's true anymore. Like, is this real? Is this not real? And it's so for me, it's like it kind of gets rid of it doesn't fully get rid of it, but it's just another part of shit that I have to deal with every day. No different than I need to go to the office to get the spreadsheet done, and it's weird, but that's just how it kind of works in my brain. And the only thing that helps me is I have to be open about it. I have to 100% keep having that communication. So it's super important for me.
So we talked about one of the most effective ways to prevent, especially in that really small time window. And it seems to me that the only way that that's really going to work is if people that are close to that person, or maybe that person themselves, takes the responsibility to control that access. The further away we get from actually being able to do something in the moment, the probably, I'm going to guess, the less likely anything we do is going to work. So now I want to talk about ERPOs for a minute. and the approach of using ERPOs under the guise of preventing suicide specifically with firearms. Because I don't agree with ERPOs, and I don't agree at all with ERPOs. But ERPOs are meant to try to solve a number of problems, not just the suicide problem. But let's talk about suicide in ERPOs and what the fundamental flaw is in that. And I guess I'll start with Matt on this one, and then Mike, if you have anything to add.
And what to you is the fundamental flaw?
Well, for me personally, the fundamental flaw is you have somebody who doesn't know or really care about this person at all coming into their life to take something away from them when they're already kind of at the end of their rope.
Yeah. I mean, it's a difficult question for me to answer because I'm with you on ERPOs. Like I think we probably feel almost the exact same way about them. And that's why I mentioned the law in Colorado that allows for family members to hold it, right? It takes the personal responsibility. And I will say, although the law it changed after like the first year or two, originally it had to be like a family member of the person, right? So it's not necessarily, or it could be, I think it could have been a law enforcement officer who's aware of, someone has made statements about wanting to harm themselves, right? But generally speaking, it's someone close to the person who is aware of this, and maybe they've tried having the conversation, hey, let me hold on to your guns, essentially, and it didn't work. And the answer is no, get the fuck out of here. I don't want to hear it. And I have sympathy for that family member. What do you do then? Do you let your loved one, die by suicide, or do you go down the red flag route? And I don't have a great answer for it, but that's why I spend so much time talking about the options that we do have. I think it's a protection piece. It's about being a protector. Not necessarily, one of the ways to be a protector, obviously, is to draw your firearm and use it to protect someone. Sometimes being a protector means having that hard conversation and insisting and finding a way to get those guns into your control and out of your loved one's hands that you're concerned about. One thing I will say is that in so many conversations that I have had with people over the years on this topic, I couldn't tell you how many people are, because I'm a representative of a university or public health or whatever, it's automatically they're, want to push back against what I'm saying. As we get deeper and deeper into the conversation, then it's like, oh yeah, well, I held on to my brother's guns when he was going through a divorce, or talking to a gun shop owner. It's like, oh yeah, well, I've got so-and-so's guns, out in the back in the safe right now. And so I think it's part of it is normalizing that behavior is really important. I don't have a great answer on the ERPO front because I feel the same way as you do about it. I have serious concerns about due process and the government being involved in that kind of way. Another thing being that when they are taken away, they're taken away for a year. That's probably not necessary in a lot of cases. And so having that be, so I have all these issues with it, but it's one of those things that's kind of like background checks for me, where in principle, I'm against it. I'm against the government being involved in this kind of way. But if we can't find the solutions on our own as the gun community, as gun owners, then what choice do we have?
Yeah, one of the things that I've been talking about for a long time, probably since 2013, when Sandy Hook happened, and it was immediately, the gun community tried very hard to shift the conversation to mental health and away from guns. And then Obama starts pushing on, well, if it's a mental health problem, we'll solve it with government. And then the gun community be like, you can't do that. And like, what did you expect? What did you expect when you didn't take responsibility where you could have, and push it off? And I don't think ERPOs are all because of that, but I do think a big part of the prevalence of ERPOs across the country are part of that.
I think, you know, in Colorado, I always point to the shooting in the King Supers in Boulder a few years ago. I remember after that happened and reading news coverage of it afterwards, and it was a family member of the shooter. I want to say it was like his dad or brother was being interviewed, and said something along the lines of, totally paraphrasing here, but something along the lines of, yeah, you know, we knew he wasn't well, we knew he was struggling, we knew things weren't right, we knew he had just bought these new guns, and I'm reading this going, what are you doing? What are you doing as a dad? What are you doing as a brother that you didn't step in? And yeah, I do believe, not to put it all on that poor person's lap, but I do believe that it's situations like that which are why we have ERPOs. If you are not going to step in and be a protector, and when you see something is wrong, when you know someone's in trouble, and you don't step in, then the government's going to.
Yeah, there's this balance. There's this comment, and I kind of want to kind of blend it in, but this comment was made, and I think we know this. Everybody here is a gun owner. We kind of understand it, but I think there's this fine line of like we're not blaming guns, but something happened with the gun, so we have to get to this position of cool. Guns are not bad by themselves on their own. We all know the cliches. If I leave it in the closet, it's gonna stay in the closet. Like we know that. But I think at some point in a society, if I have my kids, if I have my kids terrorizing the neighborhood and I do nothing about my kids terrorizing the neighborhood, at some point somebody else is going to do something about my kids terrorizing the neighborhood. They get their ass beat, they go to jail, somebody shoots them, whatever, right? Because I, as a parent, did not take responsibility for doing the proper thing with my children. It's the same thing if I have a group of friends that are idiots with guns and I choose to sit around and twiddle my thumbs, like, well, it's just people will be people, and then they do dumb shit with it, then it does fall back on us. It's either I say, hey, you guys are a bunch of fucking morons with guns, let's stop this shit, let's be better humans, or the government is going to be like, fucking round them all up and take their guns, and I don't want the government to do it, so I have to do it. So I have to do it. I do want to give Dr. Victoroff the opportunity. So yeah, I mean, these are all cliches. I think we're going to start a cliche bingo for sure. I think everybody here already understands this, but we have to have a deeper conversation far beyond the cliches of that's true 100%. I agree with Benjamin Franklin 100%, but like we also can't say, well, murderers will be murderers, and then the murder was in your house and he told you almost, I'm gonna go murder motherfuckers, and then you did nothing about it. So like there's this fine balance of we no, it's no, you don't have to be sorry. He says, oops, sorry. You don't have to be sorry. It's just we can't just say cliches. Like we have to be in a little bit more proactive where we can fix it. Because again, back to what Dr. Victoroff said is there's some shit we can't prevent, and I think we all know that and we understand that, and it's we're trying to find where the shit where we can prevent actually do something about it.
So I want to say something to Dr. Victoroff, and kind of in the context of this. Everybody's heard the cliche that flying is safer than driving, but I think with your background, you would know that there is a nuance to that statement, right? And if you just walk around saying, "Well, flying is safer than driving," you don't really know what you're talking about. You don't really understand what makes flying safe or unsafe. You don't understand what makes driving safe or unsafe. You don't really understand the risk So you're just sitting there blissfully on a private aircraft being flown by somebody with 100 hours of practice, and you're like, nope, flying is safer than driving. So, kind of to the point that Edgar was making, what do you see as our community assessment of this risk, and like, how do we get ourselves to take this more seriously? How do we get ourselves to educate ourselves better about this? How do we open our own eyes past the cliche into like what actually do we need to do personally and as a community?
Oh God! All right. Well, I have a list, but I also have stuff to do tomorrow, so you don't have time to hear it all.
We don't have a time limit, so we're here as long as you guys are here.
Yeah.
I turn into a pumpkin eventually here. Matt and I disagree, and I guess I am the minority here because I'm going to take the position that the ERPO law is one of the very few firearms laws that I actually understand the basis for. If you look at the bumper sticker that you get from the NRA, guns don't kill, people kill. That's trivial and a kind of a joke, but it is, if you took it seriously, if you really meant that, these inanimate objects that just sit around on the table, they don't jump up and start shooting people in King Supers, there had to be a sentient being behind that. If you think that's true, then we got to stop doing background checks and start doing more foreground checks. And I have a nasty and difficult slope that I try to ski on. I try to pause sliding down this slope because it's very slippery. But the slope says that means you got to regulate the people. Your problem is you're no good at doing that. And we've already talked about how difficult it is to identify the risk of suicide. My political instinct, which is not very reliable, suggests that the reason we got the ERPO law is to protect me, not to protect them. It's because of mass shootings. I think the political engine behind ERPO is, Columbine and Aurora Theater and, all the ones yet to come in the future.
Yep.
And there is some data, I think it's very weak, but it's real, that we're going to prevent a couple of those with an ERPO law. It just stands to reason that if somebody had stood up and said, wait, my kid is going crazy, somebody do something, then it'll stop a death somewhere. Okay. But my point about why, and I don't like government, I like community. Let's just say community. A bunch of people in the community need to pile on that bad actor, whether they're an evil person and they need to go away, or whether they're just confused or intoxicated or having a bad afternoon. It doesn't matter to me that there's a time I have thrown myself on people in the clinic and wrestled them to the ground once in a while.
I'd pay to see that.
When they're smaller than I am. And, the justification, the ethical justification is the same one I used before, is that I wouldn't do that if I hadn't had experience with them saying thank you, or at least someone will say thank you. Once in a while, I've thrown myself on a person committing an assault, and then other people said thank you. So there is a community spirit that allows us to intervene when nobody else can. And Matt kind of crept up to this, and I just want to step right in it. Very often the family members and the people close to and around the confused person are the last people that are able to effectively intervene. A lot of the reason why that teenager is messed up is because he lives in a household of other people that are not effective. And so it's a little bit nutty to say, let's have these ineffective people who are struggling with their own problems try to be the air traffic control for this teenager who's trying so hard to not be the the index case, but they can't because they go to their mom and they get something. They go to dad, they can't. He's in prison.
Yeah.
They go, and they go to the gang members and who knows. So this person who is alone, isolated, without resources, has no place to turn, no one who they can go to for help, and their health insurance, doesn't cover it, whatever you want. That's where the community needs to step up, and call it government, call it police, call it whatever, sometimes the police do good stuff. I've seen them actually stop a criminal, do something. And I said, thank you. Okay. So we as a group don't do it well, but we should try, all the suggestions, let us try to be the one to be the scoutmaster. Oh, a bad example. Sorry. Try to be the person that knows right from wrong and is effective. But when those red flags are flying, sometimes that's going to be the police.
Yeah,
call the police. I'm still waiting to figure out where it is that we disagree, because I agree with all of that. So
I think this is where it gets pretty weird in the gun community. Exactly what you talked about. So I accept that I really love that Benjamin Franklin quote, and I will never get away from it. But I understand that it's just a cliche. But I am 100% a 2A absolutist. I don't believe in background checks. I don't believe in the ERPOs and all this stuff. And I think this is why this conversation is important. It's just like, I also understand and I admit that we're in a society that doesn't abide by my principles, and I'm only one human. So I understand. I live in a society where there are cops and there are rulers and there are people who vote against my will. So we have to find a place where it's just like I have to live in this, because there's no other place I can go to. Every place is about the same or worse than the US in terms of laws. So like how do we find that fine line? Like, I don't like background checks in any way, shape, or form. I think Isaac is with me on this, but understand that comes with risks. I'd rather take the risk than the government intervention. So now how do we articulate this to the humans that come to our classes and come to our clinics and come to our seminars, and that it is very dangerous out there. The best we can do is minimize that risk for everyone involved as best as we can. And
we actually had somebody on the podcast quite a few years ago who was put in this position pretty starkly, where he had to, he would call himself an absolutist, but at the same time, his dad needed some kind of intervention that he could not provide personally. And he decided to use a red flag law to intervene for his dad. And I think if you'd ask him about it now, he would say that was the right thing to do. I haven't talked to him in a while, but at the time when we discussed it, the outcome was that his dad got better and life moved on and guns got, recovered. And it was, like, when you're grasping for a lifeline, you're probably going to take whatever you can get, even if it's one you on principle may not agree with.
Weird fun fact, just because my brain works really weird. The guy that Isaac's talking about, he's the reason you have that on your credit cards.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that. Yeah.
So the guy that made that, and he's the reason why you have that. He's the one that needed to be.
Yeah.
It's just an interesting fact on how life doesn't discriminate against any of that shit. Like it turned out to be a medication issue. His doctor medicated him and he went batshit crazy. And
there you go. That's all you, Dr. Victoroff. It's you and your
I don't recall that guy, but it probably was me. Yeah. Yeah, I've messed people up with drugs too. I've saved a few also. So the one thing I'm absolute about is that I don't know what to do with absolutism. I can't work with it.
Yeah.
So sorry, we're gonna let's talk across the fence on that one.
Yeah.
But,
yeah. Well,
But
like to
the one
Edgar's
thing I will
point,
say, in ethical, when you're being a philosophy student, you learn about a thing called benevolent force.
Yeah.
And this is something every parent knows about. There's sometimes when you say to your kid, I know sticking the fork in the light socket seems like a terrifically fun experiment, but we're not doing that now, okay? So this is when you know something that you have very strong ethical grounds to believe, you're right about, and you can actually preserve someone so they can go on and become an inventor, or, I don't know if I even like the guy who made the chip. I'm going to have to think that over, but that we're not talking about that. I have dealt with airline pilots who are alcoholics and schizophrenics and epileptics and diabetics.